The schoolhouse door slammed against the wooden frame with such violence that Margaret Sullivan's chalk snapped in half, leaving a jagged white line across the blackboard where she had been writing tomorrow's arithmetic lesson. The October wind howled through the gap beneath the door, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and something else, something that made her stomach clench with dread. She turned slowly, her green cotton dress rustling in the sudden silence that followed the wind's retreat, and found herself staring into the wild, desperate eyes of Sheriff Tom Bradley. His usually pristine badge was tarnished with dust, his dark hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and there was something in his expression that she had never seen before, not even during their most passionate moments when they forgot the world existed beyond these four walls. Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear that seemed to emanate from every pore of his weathered face. Margaret's heart began to hammer against her ribs as she watched him struggle to catch his breath, his chest rising and falling beneath his wrinkled shirt. The late afternoon sun streaming through the schoolhouse windows cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and in those shadows she could see the trembling of his hands as he removed his hat, crushing the brim between fingers that had once traced her face with such tenderness. "Tom, what is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the old building as another gust of wind struck its weathered sides. "What's happened?" He stepped forward, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden planks, and she could smell the horses on his clothes, the leather of his holster, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of fear that seemed to cling to him like morning frost. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if he had been shouting, or perhaps as if the words themselves were too terrible to release into the world. "They already know about us," he whispered, and his words shook her to the bone. The piece of broken chalk fell from Margaret's fingers, hitting the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness that enveloped them. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt her knees threaten to buckle beneath her, and had to grip the edge of her desk to keep herself upright. The familiar surroundings of her classroom, the place where she had felt safest, where they had stolen their precious moments together, suddenly felt foreign and threatening. "What do you mean they know?" she asked, though part of her already understood, had perhaps always known that this day would come. In a town like Tombstone, Arizona, where gossip traveled faster than tumbleweeds and secrets were currency more valuable than silver, it had been foolish to believe they could hide forever. Tom moved closer, his spurs jingling softly with each step, and she could see the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, the muscle jumping beneath his skin like a trapped animal. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, though she could see in his eyes how desperately he wanted to, how his hands ached to comfort her as they had so many times before. "Mrs. Henderson came to see me this afternoon," he said, his voice still that terrible whisper that seemed to echo in the empty spaces between them. "She said she had been walking past the schoolhouse last Tuesday evening and saw us through the window. Said she watched us for near on 10 minutes before she decided she had seen enough to know what kind of woman you really were." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering Tuesday evening with crystalline clarity. Tom had arrived just as she was finishing her lesson preparations, had kissed her with such hunger that they had forgotten to draw the curtains, forgotten everything except the need they felt for each other. She could picture Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife with her pinched face and disapproving mouth, standing in the gathering darkness and watching them with the fascination of someone discovering a particularly scandalous secret. She went straight to Eleanor, Tom continued, and Margaret opened her eyes to see him staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "My wife was waiting for me when I got home today, along with her father and half the church council. They know everything, Margaret. They know about the nights I've been coming here, about the way we've been meeting after church on Sundays, about all of it." The room seemed to tilt around Margaret as the full weight of their situation crashed down upon her. Eleanor Bradley was not just any wife, she was the daughter of the most powerful banker in 3 counties, a woman whose word carried the weight of law in their small community. If Eleanor knew about their affair, then by now half the town would know, and by tomorrow morning, there would be no corner of Tombstone where Margaret would be safe from their judgment. She sank into her chair, her hands automatically smoothing her skirts in a gesture she had learned from her mother, a meaningless action that provided no comfort but gave her something to do with her trembling fingers. Through the window, she could see the main street of Tombstone stretching away toward the distant mountains, could see the people going about their evening business, completely unaware that her world was crumbling like adobe in the rain. "What did you tell them?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Tom finally looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes a pain so deep it made her chest ache with sympathy. "I denied it," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "I told them Mrs. Henderson was mistaken, that I had only been here on official business, checking on some reports of vandalism that had been reported at the school." Margaret felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat, though she managed to suppress it. "And did they believe you?" "Eleanor did not," Tom replied, moving to the window and staring out at the street as if he could see their accusers gathering even now. "She said she had suspected for months, said she had noticed the way I looked at you during Sunday services, the way I always found excuses to walk past the schoolhouse. She said she knew her husband well enough to recognize the signs of a man who had found something he wanted more than his own soul." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each one driving home the reality of what they had done, what they had risked, and what they had lost. She had always known that Tom was married, had known that their love was forbidden, but in the stolen moments they had shared, it had been easy to forget the world beyond these walls, to pretend that they were simply a man and woman who had found something precious in each other. "What happens now?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Tom turned back to her, and in the dying light of the afternoon, his face looked older, more weathered, as if the events of the day had aged him years in a matter of hours. "Eleanor has given me a choice," he said. "I can confess publicly to the affair, ask for forgiveness from the church, and promise to have nothing more to do with you, or she will make sure that everyone in town knows exactly what kind of woman you are and what kind of man I have become." Margaret felt her heart stop beating for a moment, felt the air leave her lungs in a rush that left her dizzy and gasping. She had known this day might come, but she had not prepared herself for the brutal reality of it, for the way it would feel to have her entire life reduced to a bargaining chip in someone else's marriage. "And if you confess," she said, her voice sounding strange and distant even to her own ears, "what happens to me?" Tom's silence was answer enough. In a community like Tombstone, where respectability was the only thing that separated decent folk from the rough elements that drifted through with the mining camps and cattle drives, a woman who had been publicly branded as an adulteress would find no mercy. She would lose her position at the school, would be shunned by every decent family in town, would be left with no options except to leave everything she had ever known and start over somewhere else, if she could find anywhere that would take her. But there was something else, something that Tom didn't know yet, something that made their situation infinitely more complicated and desperate. Margaret pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the slight firmness there that had been growing more noticeable each day for the past month. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell him, had been planning to share the news tonight when he came to walk her home from school as he had so many times before. "Tom," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, "there's something you need to know." He looked at her sharply, and she saw in his expression that he had already guessed, that some instinct had warned him of what she was about to say. His face went pale beneath his tan, and his hand moved unconsciously to grip the back of the chair nearest to him. "I'm carrying your child," she whispered, and watched as the last of his composure crumbled like a dam giving way before a flood. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the mice moving in the walls, could hear the distant sound of horses on the main street, could hear her own blood rushing through her veins like a river in flood. Tom stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language, as if the words she had just uttered were so far outside the realm of possibility that his mind could not process them. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "Are you certain?" Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice to remain steady. She had known for weeks now, had felt the changes in her body, had experienced the morning sickness that had forced her to step outside during lessons to compose herself. There was no doubt, no possibility of error, no hope that she might be mistaken. Tom sank into the chair beside her desk, his head falling into his hands as the full magnitude of their situation became clear. A simple affair between a married man and an unmarried woman was scandalous enough, but a pregnancy would elevate their transgression to something far more serious, something that could not be hidden or explained away or forgotten with time. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice muffled by his hands, "what have we done?" Margaret stood and moved to the window, staring out at the town that had been her home for 3 years, the place where she had thought she would spend the rest of her life teaching the children of miners and ranchers and shopkeepers. In the distance, she could see the mountains that surrounded their valley, purple and gold in the setting sun, beautiful and implacable as ancient guardians. Soon, she would have to leave all of this behind, would have to venture into an unknown world with nothing but the clothes on her back and a growing child beneath her heart. "We have to leave," Tom said suddenly, his voice stronger now, filled with a determination that had been absent moments before. "Tonight. Before Eleanor can spread word any further, before the church council can act, before anyone else discovers your condition." Margaret turned back to him, seeing in his face a reflection of her own desperation. "Where would we go?" "California," he said without hesitation. "I have a brother in Sacramento who would help us get started. We could be married there, could tell people you're my wife, could make a new life where no one knows us or cares about our past." The plan sounded simple when he said it like that, but Margaret could see the flaws in it, the 100 ways it could go wrong. "Your wife will never let you go quietly," she said. "She'll send word ahead, we'll make sure that anyone who might help us knows what we've done." Tom stood and began pacing the length of the classroom, his boots marking time like a metronome as he worked through the problem. "Eleanor wants to avoid scandal as much as we do," he said finally. "If I simply disappear, she can tell people I went to help my brother with his ranch, that I'll be back when I've earned enough money to expand our own holdings. She can play the role of the dutiful wife waiting for her husband's return." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to think that escape could be so simple, but she had seen the look in Eleanor Bradley's eyes during Sunday services, had recognized the cold intelligence there, the calculating nature that had made her father one of the most successful businessmen in the territory. Eleanor would not be content to simply let them vanish into the night. "And what about me?" Margaret asked. "How do we explain my sudden departure?" Tom stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts desperate and determined. "Family emergency," he said. "Your sister in San Francisco has taken ill, needs your help with her children. You had to leave immediately, couldn't wait for a proper goodbye." It was plausible, Margaret had to admit. She had spoken often enough of her sister Sarah, had mentioned her frequently enough that most people in town would remember her. If she left suddenly, people might wonder, but they would accept the explanation, at least until word began to spread about what Mrs. Henderson had seen. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of the schoolhouse, and Margaret shivered despite the warmth of the afternoon. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken with the approaching storm, and she could see lightning flickering in the distance, still miles away but moving steadily closer. It seemed fitting somehow that their world should be ending in the midst of such atmospheric drama, as if nature itself was responding to the chaos they had created. "We would have to leave tonight," Tom continued, his voice gaining strength as the plan took shape in his mind. "I can gather our things while Eleanor is at her weekly ladies' meeting, can take the horses and meet you at the old mining camp north of town. We'll travel by night until we're well clear of anyone who might recognize us." Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine it, tried to picture herself riding through the darkness toward an uncertain future, leaving behind everything familiar and safe for the sake of a love that had already cost them so much. The child growing within her would be born somewhere strange and foreign, would never know the grandparents who would have loved him, would grow up with the shadow of illegitimacy hanging over his head despite any marriage ceremony they might eventually manage. But what was the alternative? To stay and face the righteous fury of a community that valued conformity above compassion, to watch her child grow up as a bastard in a place where such things mattered more than kindness or intelligence or love? To see Tom torn between his duty to his wife and his feelings for her until the conflict destroyed him? The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze, made Margaret's heart leap into her throat as she imagined Eleanor Bradley arriving with a group of church elders to confront them directly. But the rider passed by without stopping, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the distance, leaving them alone once more with their fear and their impossible choices. "I need time to think," Margaret said finally, though she knew there was precious little time left for thinking, that soon they would be forced to act whether they were ready or not. Tom nodded, though she could see the urgency in his expression, the way his hands flexed as if he wanted to grab her and flee immediately. "I'll come back at midnight," he said. "If you're here, if you're ready to go, then we'll leave together. If you're not..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. If she wasn't there, he would know she had chosen to face whatever consequences awaited her alone. He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun streaming through the windows. "Margaret," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like a benediction, like a farewell all wrapped into one. I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever choice you make, I don't regret loving you. Even if it destroys us both, I can't bring myself to regret it. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the gathering darkness with nothing but the sound of the wind and the weight of the most important decision of her life pressing down upon her like the approaching storm. Margaret stood alone in the schoolhouse long after Tom's footsteps had faded into the night, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of her desk as if memorizing every grain and imperfection. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived with a vengeance, sending sheets of rain against the windows and filling the darkness with the sound of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. She had made her decision hours ago, though admitting it to herself felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss. Her small traveling bag sat packed beside the door, containing the few precious belongings she could not bear to leave behind, her mother's wedding ring, the leather-bound book of poetry that had been her father's last gift, and the miniature portrait of her family that was all she had left of the life she had known before coming to Tombstone. When the clock on the wall chimed midnight, Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the storm, the rain immediately soaking through her dress as she made her way toward the abandoned mining camp where Tom waited with the horses. Lightning illuminated the desert landscape in stark, ghostly flashes, and she could smell the sage and creosote that grew wild in these hills, scents that would forever remind her of this night when she chose love over respectability. Tom was there as promised, holding the reins of 2 horses and looking like a man who had aged a decade in the space of a few hours. When he saw her approaching through the rain, relief flooded his face, and he reached for her bag with hands that trembled despite his obvious efforts to appear calm. "I wasn't certain you would come," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. Margaret allowed him to help her mount the smaller of the 2 horses, a gentle mare that seemed as eager as they were to be away from this place. "I couldn't stay," she replied simply. "Not anymore." They rode in silence through the night, following paths that Tom knew from his years as sheriff, staying well clear of the main roads where they might encounter other travelers or, worse, a search party sent by Eleanor to bring her wayward husband home. The rain continued for hours, turning the desert floor into treacherous mud that made every step dangerous for the horses, but also ensuring that their tracks would be washed away before dawn. It was nearly sunrise when they finally stopped to rest at a small creek that ran through a canyon hidden deep in the hills. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked scrubbed clean and new, with the scent of wet earth and growing things filling the air. Margaret dismounted stiffly, her body aching from the long ride, and realized that this was the first time in hours that she had allowed herself to truly think about what they had done. They were fugitives now, she supposed, though they had broken no law except the unwritten codes of propriety that governed small towns like Tombstone. Still, the knowledge that they could never return, that they had left behind everything familiar and safe, settled over her like a heavy blanket. Tom was watering the horses when she noticed the rider approaching from the south, a lone figure moving steadily toward their hidden canyon with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Margaret's heart began to race as she recognized the familiar silhouette, the way the man sat his horse, the distinctive hat that had become as much a part of him as his badge. "Tom," she whispered, and something in her voice made him look up sharply from where he knelt beside the creek. The rider was Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison, Tom's own second-in-command, the young man he had trained and trusted with his life more times than either of them could count. Jake reined in his horse at the edge of their small camp and dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun in a gesture that was both familiar and suddenly threatening. "Morning, Tom," Jake said, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had always characterized their friendship. "Miss Sullivan." Margaret felt Tom tense beside her, felt the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was preparing for trouble. "Jake," he replied carefully. "Bit early for you to be out riding, isn't it?" Jake smiled, but there was no humor in the expression, only a cold satisfaction that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Mrs. Bradley sent me," he said simply. "Seems she was concerned about her husband's sudden departure. Asked me to make sure he was safe." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of water moving over stones and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Margaret could see in Tom's face the moment he understood that their escape had been anticipated, that Eleanor had been one step ahead of them from the beginning. "She knows about the baby," Jake continued, his eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her want to look away. Knows you've been meeting at the schoolhouse for months. Knows exactly where you were headed and why. Tom's hand moved toward his gun, but Jake was faster, his weapon clearing leather with the smooth precision of a man who had spent years practicing for exactly such a moment. I wouldn't, Tom. I've got orders to bring you both back alive if possible, but Mrs. Bradley was very clear about what she expects if you resist. Margaret felt the world tilt around her as the full scope of Eleanor's revenge became clear. This had never been about avoiding scandal or protecting reputations. This had been about power, about control, about ensuring that no one who crossed Eleanor Bradley would ever escape the consequences of their actions. What does she want? Tom asked, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. Jake's smile widened, and Margaret saw in his young face the ambition that had always lurked beneath his loyalty, the hunger for advancement that Eleanor had clearly recognized and exploited. She wants you to come home, he said. Both of you. She wants to discuss the terms of your return like civilized people. The sun was fully above the horizon now, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and red that reminded Margaret of the schoolhouse windows in the late afternoon, of the place where her old life had ended and this uncertain future had begun. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the small life growing there, and wondered what kind of world she was bringing a child into, what kind of future awaited them all in the shadow of Eleanor Bradley's revenge. Tom looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes the same question that was echoing in her own heart: how far would they go for love, and how much were they willing to sacrifice for a freedom that might already be lost? The answer, Margaret realized, would determine not only their fate, but the fate of the child who would inherit whatever consequences flowed from this moment of reckoning in the desert dawn.